Daniel Holt is in year 2 of an 11-year sentence. He didn't do it. His dog knew exactly where the proof was for 12 months. And nobody listened. Every morning for 12 months, the shepherd walked to the same patch of dirt on the edge of town. Same post, same scratch, same look back. Then he went home alone. Officer Emma Cole had looked away more times than she could count. Her captain made it simple. Stray dog, Cole. Not a case, year 2. Daniel's appeal was denied. His lawyer stopped calling. 10 more years wasn't a sentence. It was a slow ending. This morning, Duke stopped at the fence. He looked at Emma. 7 seconds. 8. His eyes didn't ask. They told. Emma didn't call it in. She just clipped her flashlight to her belt and walked through the gate. Rail yard, dead grass, rust. Duke moved like he'd done this 1,000 times because he had. Duke sat at the post, scratched once at the base, turned and looked at Emma. The same move, the same spot. 365 mornings. She crouched and turned on the light. Dark fabric, dense cotton, torn, not cut. The kind of tear that happens when someone is running hard and doesn't see the metal coming. Emma didn't touch it. Her hand stopped 2 inches away. An innocent man had been in a cell for 2 years. The answer had been here the whole time, waiting for someone to finally look. Thank you for being here. Please subscribe and like this video. And before we continue, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments. I love knowing who's out there listening. Cedar Falls, population 4,312. The kind of town where everybody knows your name, and everybody knew Daniel Holt was guilty. 11 years on the force, commendations on the wall, the officer who showed up first and left last. Nobody locked their doors when Daniel Holt was on patrol. That was the man Cedar Falls thought they knew. Then came March 14th. A neighbor reported a break-in 2 blocks from Daniel's house. Daniel responded, first on scene. When backup arrived 4 minutes later, they found him standing over Ray Stockton, unconscious, bleeding. Daniel's baton on the ground beside him. Stockton spent 9 days in the hospital. When he woke up, he gave one statement, 12 words. It was Daniel Holt. He came at me without warning, unprovoked. Then he folded his hands and waited, like a man who had rehearsed it. No cameras on that block. No other witnesses. The detective closed the case in 48 hours. 48. 3 years on the force, the fastest close of his career. Nobody asked why he was in such a hurry. Duke was with Daniel that night. When backup arrived and grabbed Daniel, Duke didn't go for them, and he went for the fence line, the dark side of the lot, away from Daniel, away from Stockton, towards something nobody else was looking at. They pulled him back, logged it as aggressive behavior, took him away in a separate vehicle. The trial lasted 6 days. The jury deliberated 2 hours and 40 minutes. 11 years. Daniel stood and said nothing. His lawyer filed an appeal that afternoon. Denied. Filed a second. Denied. The last email came on a Tuesday. I've done everything I can. Daniel printed it out, folded it twice, put it in the box under his bunk. He still has it. Ray Stockton still lives 2 blocks from Daniel's empty house. Quiet man, respected, shows up to town meetings, shovels his neighbor's driveway in winter. Nobody ever looked twice at Ray Stockton. The detective who closed the case in 48 hours, he got a promotion 4 months later. And the piece of dark fabric wound into the rust at the rail yard post, the one Duke had been scratching at for 12 months. Nobody had tested it. Nobody had even touched it until this morning. Emma didn't move for a full minute. She crouched there in the gravel, flashlight still on, hands still 2 inches from the fabric. Duke sat beside her, not pushing, not scratching, just waiting, like he'd been waiting for this exact moment for a year. She knew what this was, dense cotton, dark blue, torn from the bottom, low on the post, maybe knee height. Someone running hard in the dark didn't see the metal coming. The tear was old, but protected by the rust. 12 months of rain in Cedar Falls winters, and it was still here, still readable. She pulled out her phone, took 4 photos. Then she stood up. She called her captain at 7:42 in the morning. He picked up on the second ring. She told him about the fabric, the post, the location. 12 months of Duke coming to the same spot. There was a pause, then, Cole, the whole case is closed, has been for 2 years. You're describing a stray dog and a piece of trash caught in a fence. She looked at Duke. Duke looked at the fabric. Yes, sir, she said, and hung up. She had two choices: walk away, same as every morning for 12 months, or pull the fabric, bag it, and send it to the state lab herself, on her own time, with her own money, without authorization. If she was wrong, she'd lose her badge. If she was right, she didn't want to think about what that meant, about who in Cedar Falls had something to hide. Duke hadn't moved. He sat at the base of the post like he'd been bolted there. His eyes were on Emma, not on the fabric anymore, on her. Like the fabric part was done. Like that wasn't the question anymore. Emma crouched back down. She put on a latex glove. She kept two in her jacket pocket, habit from 4 years of patrol. She reached toward the fabric. Her hand was steady. It came away in one piece, roughly 4 inches by 3. The tear was clean on one side, ragged on the other. She turned it over. The inside surface was darker, protected from weather by the rust. And there, on the inner face of the fabric, was something that made Emma's throat close. A partial print, not a fingerprint, a stamp, small, faded, but readable. 3 letters and a number, a uniform identifier, Cedar Falls PD issue. This fabric didn't come from a civilian, it came from a uniform. Someone who worked in her building had been running through that rail yard on the night of March 14th, and they'd been running fast enough to tear their clothes on a fence post. And for 12 months, nobody had looked, because nobody had followed the dog. Emma walked back into the station at 8:14, evidence bag in her left hand, phone in her right. Duke had followed her to the gate and stopped there. He didn't come inside. He never came inside. She'd noticed that before but never thought about why. Now she thought about it. She went straight to her locker, didn't stop at the front desk, didn't say good morning to anyone. She had the bag sealed and labeled before she sat down. State Forensics Lab was 90 miles north. Standard processing time, 3 to 4 weeks. Rush processing, 4 days, but it required a supervisor's signature she didn't have. She stared at the bag for a while. Then she looked up the number for the state lab's civilian submission line, the one that didn't require a badge number. Cedar Falls PD issued 3 uniform styles between 2019 and 2022. Dark navy cotton blend. The identifier stamp on the inner lining, 3 letters, 1 number, was added starting January 2020. It narrowed the pool. Every officer who received a uniform in that window. Emma pulled the personnel roster on her department laptop. 41 names. She printed it, folded it once, put it in her jacket pocket next to where the latex gloves used to be. She pulled the Holt case file next, not the official summary, the raw intake report. 43 pages. She'd never read it before. Nobody in her unit had. It was closed before she transferred in. The first thing she noticed was the timestamp. Backup arrived at the scene at 11:47 p.m. Daniel had called it in at 11:43, 4 minutes. But the call log showed something else. Ray Stockton had called 911 at 11:41, 2 minutes before Daniel. Stockton called before Daniel arrived. Emma read that line 3 times. Stockton's 911 call lasted 40 seconds. The transcript was in the file. There's someone outside my property. I think it might be... Then a pause, 4 seconds. Then, never mind, I think I know who it is. He hung up. The dispatcher tried to call back. No answer. 2 minutes later, Daniel Holt called in a disturbance. 4 minutes after that, backup found Daniel standing over Stockton with a baton on the ground. Emma sat back in her chair. Stockton knew who was coming. Before Daniel got there, he knew. The detective who closed the case in 48 hours was named Mercer. Frank Mercer, 18 years on the force. Emma had seen him in the building maybe a dozen times. Quiet man, kept to himself, always parked in the same spot near the back entrance. He'd retired 14 months ago, 4 months after the Holt conviction. Emma searched his name in the personnel system. His retirement paperwork was filed the same week Daniel's second appeal was denied. Same week, Emma wrote that down. She went back to the list of 41 names. She wasn't looking for guilt yet, just proximity. Who was on duty the night of March 14th? Who had access to the rail yard lot? Who lived or worked within 4 blocks of the scene? She cross-referenced the shift log. 11 officers were on duty that night. She circled 11 names, then she looked at the rail yard on the map. The fence line where Duke always stopped was on the east side, the side that backed up to Stockton's property line. Not Daniel's route in Stockton's backyard. Emma put her pen down. Daniel Holt had approached from the north. That was in the report. The rail yard fence was east, between Stockton's property and the lot. If someone ran from Stockton's yard through the rail yard that night, they weren't running toward the scene. They were running away from it, before backup arrived, before the lights came on. Duke hadn't been scratching at evidence of Daniel being there. Duke had been scratching at evidence of someone leaving. Emma stood up. Her chair scraped back loud enough that the officer at the next desk looked over. She didn't notice. She looked up Mercer's home address, 4 blocks from the rail yard. She looked up Stockton's property records. Stockton had purchased his house in 2019, the same year Mercer transferred to Cedar Falls from a department 2 counties over. Emma searched both names together. Nothing in the public record. Then she searched the old community newsletter archive. Cedar Falls put out a monthly PDF, had been doing it for 12 years. February 2020, page 3, a photo from the Cedar Falls winter fundraiser. Ray Stockton and Frank Mercer, standing side by side, both smiling. Mercer's hand on Stockton's shoulder. The caption read, "Old friends reunite in Cedar Falls." Old friends. Emma walked to the window. Duke was still at the gate, sitting, watching the entrance. He'd been there for over an hour. She thought about the night of March 14th, Duke going for the fence line. Not the people, the fence, the east fence, the rail yard side. A trained K9 doesn't chase shadows. He follows scent. He followed a scent that night, and 3 officers pulled him back and logged it as aggression. And for 12 months, he came back to the same spot every morning because the scent was still there, locked in the rust, waiting. Emma picked up her phone. She didn't call her captain. She called the state attorney's office. It rang 4 times. Someone picked up. "This is Officer Emma Cole, Cedar Falls PD," she said. "I need to report potential evidence tampering in a closed conviction. The name is Daniel Holt." There was a pause on the line. Then, "Hold, please." Emma held. Duke sat at the gate and didn't move. The state attorney's office put Emma on hold for 11 minutes. She counted them. She stood at her kitchen window with the phone pressed to her ear and watched Duke sitting on the sidewalk below. He hadn't moved since she got home. 11 minutes is a long time when you're standing still. Long enough to wonder if you'd made a mistake. Long enough to think about your captain's voice that morning. "Stray dog, Cole. Not a case." Long enough to look at the evidence bag on her counter and ask yourself if a piece of torn fabric and 12 months of a dog's routine was enough to reopen a closed conviction. It wasn't. She knew that. But it was enough to make one phone call. So she'd made it. She kept counting. When the investigator came back on the line, his name was Garrett. He didn't apologize for the hold. He asked her 3 questions in a flat, careful voice. How old was the evidence? Had it been officially logged? Had she touched it with ungloved hands? She answered all 3. He was quiet for a moment after the 3rd answer. The kind of quiet that means someone is writing something down. Then he said, "Officer Cole, I need you to courier that bag to this office today. Not mail, courier. And I need you to not discuss this with anyone in your department until you hear from me." Emma asked why. He said, "Because if what you're describing is accurate, there are people in your building who would prefer this conversation never happened." Emma looked at Duke on the sidewalk. He was looking up at her window. "I'll drive it up myself," she said. Garrett said that was fine. He gave her an address. She wrote it on the back of the 41 names list. Then she asked, "How long have you been waiting for someone to call about Daniel Holt?" There was a pause. Garrett said, "That's not something I can answer right now." He hung up. Emma stood at the window for another minute. Duke still hadn't moved. She signed out a personal day at 11 a.m. Told the desk sergeant she had a family matter. He didn't ask follow-up questions. She walked past her captain's office with the evidence bag in a plain paper bag inside her jacket. Her heart rate was elevated. She noticed it the way you notice a sound in a wall. Present, persistent, not dangerous yet. She got to her car without anyone stopping her, sat in the driver's seat for 30 seconds. Then she pulled out and headed north on Route 9. 90 miles. She'd looked up Daniel Holt before she left. 44 years old, transferred to Cedar Falls Correctional 14 months ago, closer to home. No visitors in the last 8 months. His last medical report was in the Public Inmate Health Database, flagged for low body weight and elevated blood pressure. The prison doctor had noted it twice, recommended follow-up both times. There was no record of follow-up. She thought about that for most of the drive. A man losing weight in a cell 900 miles from a piece of fabric that might be the reason he's there. She drove at exactly the speed limit the whole way. She didn't want to get pulled over. Not today. The state lab was a gray building off Route 9 with a parking lot that needed repaving and a front desk that smelled like recycled air and old coffee. She handed the bag to a technician named Priya who signed for it without looking up. Then Priya looked at the label. Then she looked at Emma. Cedar Falls PD, Emma nodded. Priya looked at the bag one more time, the way people look at something when they're recalibrating what they thought it was. This is from the Holt case, she said. It wasn't a question. Emma said she believed so. Priya set the bag down on the counter, carefully, differently than she'd picked it up, the way you set something down when it stopped being routine. Rush processing, she said. Emma said yes. Priya said she'd need authorization from the requesting party. Emma gave her Garrett's name and direct line. Priya wrote it down slowly, like she was making sure she got every letter right. Then she said, 4 days. Emma said thank you. She drove home. Duke was at her apartment door when she got back. She didn't know how he'd found her address. She'd never brought him here. She stood in the hallway for a moment looking at him. He looked back. She opened the door and he walked in and lay down in front of the couch and didn't move. She sat on the floor next to him. She didn't eat dinner. She didn't think he did either, though she left water out and it was lower in the morning. 4 days is 96 hours. Emma worked all 4 of them. She didn't tell her captain. She didn't tell her partner. She kept the 41 names folded in her jacket and crossed off the ones with solid alibis one by one. Carefully, at her kitchen table, after her shifts ended. Night 1, she eliminated 7. 3 were on vacation that week. 2 were on medical leave. 2 had time-stamped body cam footage from the other side of town. Night 2, she eliminated 4 more. Partial alibi on 1, wrong uniform batch on 2, 1 had transferred in after 2021. By the morning of day 3, she had 6 names left. All 6 were on duty March 14th. All 6 had received uniforms in the 2020 window. All 6 had worked cases that touched either Stockton's neighborhood or the rail yard lot in the 18 months before the incident. She put the list on her kitchen table and looked at it with cold coffee going warm beside her and Duke asleep at her feet with his chin on her left shoe. 6 names. 1 of them had been running through that rail yard the night Daniel Holt's life ended. 1 of them had torn their uniform on a rusted fence post in the dark and kept running. And for 2 years, that piece of fabric had been sitting in the rust, waiting for someone to follow a dog. She kept coming back to Mercer. Not because he was the obvious answer, because he wasn't. Obvious answers in Cedar Falls had already sent 1 innocent man to prison. She wasn't going to rush, but Mercer had closed the case in 48 hours. 3 years on the fastest close of his career. His retirement papers filed the same week Daniel's last appeal was denied. And the photo from the February 2020 newsletter. Mercer's hand on Stockton's shoulder. Old friends. She pulled Mercer's old case files. Not the Holt case. His other cases. 18 years of them. She was looking for a pattern. She found one on the 3rd hour. 4 cases in 6 years where the primary suspect was someone Mercer knew personally. A neighbor. A former colleague. A man who'd done work on Mercer's house. All 4 cases closed fast. All 4 ended in convictions. None of the 4 defendants had ever filed a successful appeal. She didn't know yet if that meant anything beyond confirmation bias and bad luck. But she wrote Mercer's name at the top of a clean page and circled it. Then she circled it again. Then she made another coffee and sat down and read every page of those 4 case files until 2 in the morning, while Duke breathed slowly on her left shoe and the apartment was quiet. On day 2, she drove past Stockton's house. She told herself she was just checking the neighborhood. Normal patrol instinct. She didn't believe herself, but she went anyway. He was in the driveway when she passed, doing nothing in particular, looking at his car, the way people look at things they're not really seeing. Dark blue jacket. Cedar Falls was cold in March, but it was April now. 12 degrees above freezing that afternoon, sun out. She kept driving. At the corner, she stopped. Dark blue jacket, dense cotton from the look of it. She turned the car around, drove past again. He was gone, inside. She sat at the corner for 4 minutes watching his front door. Nothing moved. She drove home and pulled out the evidence photo she'd taken at the rail yard. Dense cotton, dark blue. She looked at the photo for a long time. Then she thought about the fact that Ray Stockton still lived 2 blocks from Daniel's empty house, still shoveled his neighbor's driveway in winter, still showed up to town meetings, still wore a dark blue jacket in April. And Daniel Holt was 900 miles away in a room with 42 other men eating powdered eggs and losing weight, while his dog slept on Emma's floor and waited for something neither of them could name yet. Garrett called on day 3, not with results. The lab wasn't done. He called to tell her something else. He'd pulled the original investigation file from the state archive, the version that predated the public record, the one that existed before the case was packaged for trial. There were things in it that hadn't made it into the courtroom. One thing in particular, a witness statement from a gas station attendant 3 blocks from the scene, logged March 15th, the morning after the incident. The attendant had seen a man running east from Stockton Street at approximately 11:42 p.m., running hard, dark jacket. The statement was 2 paragraphs. It had been signed by the attending officer. The attending officer was Frank Mercer. The statement had been logged, then removed from the active file before the case went to the prosecutor. Emma sat down when Garrett told her that. He buried it, she said. Garrett said, "It looks that way." There was a pause. Emma asked if Daniel's lawyers had ever seen it. Garrett said, no. She asked if the gas station attendant was still in Cedar Falls. Garrett said he was checking. Then he said, "Officer Cole, how long have you been on the force?" She said 4 years. He said, "Don't do anything until the lab calls. Nothing. Don't change your routine. Don't change how you talk to people in your building. Don't look at anyone differently. Can you do that?" Emma looked at Mercer's name on the page, circled twice. She said yes. She hung up and sat with the phone in her hand for a while. Duke lifted his head. She looked at him. Then she put the phone down and went to make dinner and didn't touch the page again that night. It was the hardest thing she'd done in 4 years on the force. 900 miles south, Daniel Holt was eating breakfast in a room with 42 other men. Tuesday, powdered eggs and 2 slices of white bread that arrived soft and left dry. He ate slowly, the way men eat when they've stopped tasting food, not because they're not hungry, but because hunger stopped being interesting a long time ago. His bunkmate Terrence, 3 years into a 7-year sentence for something Daniel had never asked about, watched him eat sometimes. That Tuesday he said, "You always look like you're waiting for something." Daniel didn't answer right away. He finished the eggs. He thought about the question. He said, "I used to be." Terrence nodded like that made sense. It did make sense. Daniel had stopped waiting around month 8, after the second appeal, after the lawyer's last email, after he'd done the math enough times to understand what 9 more years actually meant for a man with elevated blood pressure and no visitors and 30 seconds of Tuesday morning light before a guard moved him along. He carried his tray to the window and stood in the light. 30 seconds. Then the guard's hand on his shoulder. Then the corridor. Then the cell. He sat on the edge of his bunk and looked at his hands for a while. He did that sometimes. Just looked at them. They were the hands of a man who had spent 11 years doing the job right. They looked the same as they always had. That was the part he couldn't get used to. That nothing on the outside showed what had happened on the inside. He lay back and stared at the ceiling and listened to the sounds of 42 other men living around him and thought about nothing in particular until the lights went out. The lab called on day 4, 7 a.m. Emma was already awake. She'd been awake since 5:30. Duke was up too, sitting by the door like he knew something was arriving. The call wasn't from Priya. It was from a senior analyst named Dr. Reeves. He didn't say hello. He said, "We have results on the Cedar Falls submission." Emma said she was listening. He said, "The fabric is consistent with Cedar Falls PD, issue uniform, 2020 batch, officer grade. The identifier stamp matches your department's internal coding system for that year." Then he paused. Emma didn't fill the pause. She'd learned not to fill pauses from 4 years of interviewing witnesses. Reeves said, "We also recovered biological material from the interface of the fabric." Emma's hand tightened on the phone. She asked what kind. He said, "Skin cells, caught in the torn edge where the fibers separated, protected from weather exposure by the rust overlay. That's why they survived 12 months outdoors." Emma closed her eyes. Behind her, she heard Duke stand up. She asked, "Can you get a profile?" Reeves said, "We already did." He read her the result. She wrote it down on the clean page under Mercer's circled name. One name underlined once. She stared at both names for a long time. Then she called Garrett. He picked up on the first ring like he'd been waiting with the phone in his hand. She read him the name. He was quiet for 4 seconds. 4 full seconds. Then he said, "Officer Cole, go to work today. Normal shift, normal everything. Do not approach this individual. Do not change anything." Emma looked at the page. 2 names, one circled, one underlined. She asked, "Is it enough?" Garrett said, "It's enough. We're coming to Cedar Falls tomorrow morning. And when we arrive, we're going to need you to be the one who opens the door." Emma looked at Duke. Duke looked at the door. "I'll be here," she said. Garrett arrived in Cedar Falls at 7:41 a.m. Not alone. 2 state investigators in a gray sedan, a prosecutor from the Attorney General's office in a separate car. They parked on different streets. Emma met Garrett at the corner of Kellner and Main, 2 blocks from the station. He was shorter than she'd imagined from the phone. Gray jacket, no tie, coffee in his hand. He looked at her for a moment before he said anything. Then he said, "You did good work, Cole." She said she followed a dog. He said, "Same thing." They walked toward the station together. Duke was already at the gate. He'd been there since 6. Garrett looked at him. Duke looked at Garrett. Then Duke looked at Emma. She gave him a small nod she didn't plan. He sat back down. Garrett watched the exchange and didn't say anything about it. Some things don't need commentary. The plan was simple in structure and complicated in every other way. The state investigators would enter through the back. The prosecutor would wait in the parking lot with the arrest paperwork already signed by a judge in the state capitol, signed at 11 p.m. the night before, which meant Garrett had moved faster than he'd let on. Emma's job was to be at her desk at normal time doing normal things. When the investigators located the individual, they would radio Garrett. Garrett would come to Emma. Emma would be the one to make the approach. Garrett had explained why on the phone the night before. "If this goes sideways," he'd said, "I want the person who found the evidence to be the last face they see before it's over." Emma had asked if that was standard procedure. He'd said no. She'd said, "Then why?" He'd said, "Because you followed a dog for 12 months that nobody else would follow. You earned the door." Emma sat at her desk at 7:58. 2 minutes early, she logged into her terminal, pulled up a noise complaint from the night before. Routine, boring, exactly the kind of thing that she'd be doing on a normal Thursday morning. Her hands were steady. She was surprised by that. She'd expected them to shake. They didn't. Duke was visible through the front window, still at the gate. 3 officers walked past her desk in the first 20 minutes. Her captain stopped to ask if she'd finished the incident report from Tuesday. She said she'd have it by noon. He said fine and walked away. She watched him go and thought about the 41 names and the 6 that were left and the one that was underlined on her kitchen table at home. She thought about whether her captain was one of the 35 she'd eliminated. She'd eliminated him on night 1. Solid alibi. He'd been at a department conference in Harrisburg. Timestamp check-in. 3 witnesses. She was glad she checked. She was glad it wasn't him. At 8:22, her radio gave one click. Garrett's signal? Located. Emma stood up. She straightened her jacket. She walked down the east corridor toward the locker room without hurrying. Normal pace, the kind of pace that doesn't turn heads. She passed two officers she knew by name. Said good morning to both of them. Neither looked at her twice. At the end of the corridor, she pushed through the door to the back stairwell, where Garrett was waiting with one of the state investigators. Garrett said, "He's in the equipment room, ground floor, end of the south hall." Emma said, "I know where it is." Garrett said, "You go in first. We're right behind you." Emma said, "How close?" He said, "Close enough." She walked the south hall alone, 14 steps. She counted them, not because she was scared, because counting was something to do with the part of her brain that wanted to run through the next 60 seconds, and she needed that part to be quiet. 14 steps. She pushed open the equipment room door. Ray Stockton was at the back bench, dark blue jacket on the hook behind him. He was checking out a radio unit, logging the serial number in the equipment binder. He looked up when she came in. He didn't recognize her at first. She was new enough that most of the older officers still placed her as the junior from the second floor. Then something shifted in his face. Not guilt, not fear, just a very small recalibration. The kind of look a careful man gives when something unexpected walks through a door. He said, "Morning." She said, "Morning." She walked toward him at normal pace. Then she said, "Ray Stockton, I need you to put your hands on the bench." He didn't run. She'd half expected him to run. He didn't. He set the equipment binder down slowly, the way a man sets something down when he's decided something, and he put both hands flat on the bench. The state investigators were through the door in 4 seconds. Garrett behind them. Stockton didn't turn around. He kept his eyes on Emma. She held his gaze. He said, "How?" She said, "A piece of your jacket." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the dark blue jacket on the hook behind him, and something happened in his expression that wasn't quite grief and wasn't quite relief, but was somewhere between them. The kind of look men get when something they've been carrying for 2 years finally has a name. He said, "I kept meaning to throw it out." She said, "Why didn't you?" He said, "I don't know. Maybe I didn't want to." The handcuffs went on at 8:31 a.m. The prosecutor was already on the phone with the state corrections facility where Daniel Holt was housed, 900 miles south, when Stockton was walked through the back entrance to the waiting car. Emma stood at the door and watched the car pull out of the lot. She stood there for a while after it was gone. Garrett came and stood beside her. He said, "There'll be paperwork. A lot of it, probably a hearing within the week." Daniel's conviction, given the buried witness statement, the DNA, and Stockton's possession of the matching garment, Garrett thought 90 days, maybe less. Emma said, "He's been in there 2 years." Garrett said, "I know." She said, "His health report said." Garrett said, "I read it. He's being transferred to the medical unit today." She nodded. Garrett said, "You should know what you did here, going to the state lab without authorization, without a supervisor's signature. Technically, that's a disciplinary matter." Emma looked at him. He said, "I said technically." He handed her a folded document, signed by the Attorney General. Full authorization, backdated 48 hours. She looked at it, then she looked at Garrett. He said, "You followed a dog. I signed a piece of paper. Seemed fair." Frank Mercer was arrested at his home at 9:15 the same morning. Emma wasn't there for that one. She heard about it from Garrett's second call at 10 a.m. Mercer had opened the door in a bathrobe and looked at the investigators for a long moment and then stepped aside without a word. Like a man who had been expecting a knock for 2 years and had gotten tired of waiting for it. His lawyer was on the phone before the car reached the county line. It didn't matter. The buried witness statement was enough on its own. The DNA was enough on its own. Together they were the kind of case that doesn't go to trial, the kind that ends in a quiet room with a signed agreement and no cameras. Garrett said Mercer would likely cooperate in exchange for reduced charges. He said the gas station attendant from March 15th had been located, still in Cedar Falls, still at the same address, still remembered exactly what he'd seen that night. A man running east, dark jacket, hard and fast like something was chasing him. Except nothing was chasing him. He was the thing that needed to be caught. It had just taken 2 years and a dog and one officer who couldn't stop looking at a piece of rust on a fence post to catch him. Emma sat at her desk for the rest of the morning and did her paperwork. The noise complaint, 2 vehicle reports, a property log from Tuesday. Normal work. The kind of work that keeps the world from noticing that something enormous just happened in the south hallway of a small police station in a town of 4,312 people. At noon, her captain called her into his office. She sat down. He looked at her for a long time. Then he said, "I heard what you did." She said she'd followed procedure. He said, "You called the state attorney without telling me." She said, "Yes, sir." He said, "Without a supervisor's signature on the lab submission." She said, "Yes, sir." He leaned back. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The state attorney's office called me this morning. Before I came in, told me what you'd found, told me about the fabric and Mercer and Stockton." He paused. He said, "I told them I'd assigned you to it." Emma looked at him. He said, "You're going to need that on the record when this goes to hearing." She said, "Thank you, sir." He said, "Don't thank me. I should have followed the dog." He stood up, meeting over. Daniel Holt was told at 2:15 p.m. on a Thursday that his conviction was under emergency review. A prison counselor sat across from him in a room the size of a closet and read from a document, and Daniel sat very still and listened to every word. The counselor said, "Do you understand what this means?" Daniel said he understood. He didn't ask questions. He didn't cry. He sat with his hands on his knees and looked at the table and breathed. The counselor asked if he wanted to call anyone. Daniel said there was no one to call. The counselor said, "Is there anything you want?" Daniel thought about that for a moment. He said, "I want to know if the dog is okay." The counselor didn't know what that meant. She wrote it down anyway. 3 weeks later, the paperwork was done. The conviction was overturned on a Tuesday. The same day of the week, Daniel had been eating powdered eggs and standing in 30 seconds of light. The Attorney General made a statement. There were cameras outside the courthouse. Mom didn't go to the courthouse. She had a shift. She heard about the statement secondhand from her captain, who stopped by her desk and said 2 words. "It's done." She nodded. She went back to her report. Daniel was released on a Thursday morning. Cedar Falls Correctional. Main entrance. 7 a.m. He'd been given new clothes the night before. Civilian clothes, the first he'd worn in 2 years. They fit wrong. He stood at the main entrance for a moment before he pushed through the door. He wasn't sure what he'd expected. A car, maybe. Someone from the attorney's office. A camera. There was none of that. There was a gray morning and a parking lot and a road, and at the end of the road there was Emma Cole leaning against her car with her arms folded, and sitting beside her on the pavement, perfectly still, ears up, watching the door, Duke. Daniel stopped walking. Duke stood up. He didn't run. He walked forward at a steady pace, the way he always moved when he'd located what he was looking for. He stopped 2 feet from Daniel and looked up at him. Daniel crouched down. He put both hands on the sides of Duke's face. Duke pressed his forehead against Daniel's chest and held it there. He made no sound. Daniel made no sound either. He just stayed there on the pavement with both hands on his dog and his eyes closed for a long time. Emma looked at the road. Some things are not for watching. She drove them both to a diner on Route 9. Daniel ate real eggs. Duke sat under the table with his chin on Daniel's shoe. They didn't talk much. Emma asked how he felt. Daniel said he didn't know yet. She said that was fine. He looked out the window at the road for a while. Then he said, "How did you know to follow him?" She said, "I didn't. I just stopped not following him." He nodded like that made sense. It did make sense. He looked down at Duke under the table. Duke looked back up at him. Daniel said, "He came every morning." Emma said, "Every morning for 12 months. He looked at her. He said, "And nobody followed him." She said, "Nobody followed him." He looked back out the window. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "He knew. He always knew." She said, "Yes." Daniel picked up his coffee. His hands were steady. He said, "Good dog." Under the table, Duke's tail moved once against the floor. That was enough. That was everything.